the AI. All right. So I want to welcome everybody to Courageous Conversations. Today I am joined, well, first of all, I'm Sally Snyder and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the coordinator of diversity programming at Rogue Community College. And joining me today, I have Reverend Ernestine Flemister of St. Luke's Episcopal Church. I also have Reverend Tom Berry joining us from his car. He's with Presbyterian Church, Bethany Presbyterian Church, and he is on a retreat right now and joining us. I have Jenny Jackson, Project Youth Plus and RCC faculty. And soon, if we don't yet, I haven't seen Ryan join us yet, but Reverend Ryan Scott from Newman United Methodist, he is at a roundtable discussion about a warming shelter here in Grants Pass. So we will welcome him when he's available. And then we have a special guest I will introduce in a moment. So our mission is to enrich, support, and celebrate our diverse community by acting as a catalyst for inclusion, continuous learning, understanding, and acceptance through active engagement and facilitation of educational opportunities that challenge biases and deepen conversations. And of course, our ground rules, which we have adapted from the Conversation Cafe, we want to create a space to learn, share, and grow. And to do that, we ask everyone, this little thing is in my way, isn't it? There we go. Oh, to be open-minded, to listen to all points of view and be curious. Acceptance, please suspend judgment as best you can. Seek to understand rather than to persuade or convert. Question old assumptions and look for new insights. If you're speaking, please go for honesty and depth, but don't go on and on. And also speak only about yourself and what has personal meaning. So generally we meet on Tuesdays, fourth Tuesdays from noon to 1. This is the third Tuesday, and then we're taking a break for December. So our next meeting will be on a Monday evening, January 17th, to celebrate Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I have possibly hybrid here. We will definitely have our Zoom option, and we're hoping we will be able to also meet in person. So we have the opportunity to do that. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing here. Bear with me while I get my screens rearranged. So now sitting here. There we go. So now sitting next to me, it is my honor to have David West join us. He is here to acknowledge the truth of the land that we live upon. And he is an enrolled member and elder of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And he's Director Emeritus of Native American Programs at Southern Oregon University, currently retired, which, as I always say, means he's doing more than ever. And so I'm now going to have David read the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Sally. Good day to each one. In our desire for collective healing and partnership, we offer this acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples and their connections to the land that Rogue Community College occupies. This acknowledgement was developed in conversation between Grand Ronde tribal staff, Siletz tribal staff, and Native American programs faculty and staff at Southern Oregon University. It continues to be a living statement through this ongoing partnership. On behalf of Rogue Community College and Grandmother Agnes Baker Pilgrim of the Takelma tribe, I would like to take this moment to acknowledge that Rogue Community College is located within the ancestral homelands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Letgawa peoples, who lived here since time immemorial. These tribes were displaced during rapid Euro-American colonization, the gold rush, and armed conflict between 1851 and 1856. In the 1850s, discovery of gold and settlement brought thousands of Euro-Americans to their lands, leading to warfare, epidemics, starvation, and villages being burned. In 1853, the first of several treaties were signed, confederating these tribes and others together, who would then be referred to as the Rogue River Tribe. These treaties ceded most of their homelands to the United States, and in return, they were guaranteed a permanent homeland reserved for them. At the end of the Rogue River Wars in 1856, these tribes and many other tribes from Western Oregon were removed to the Siletz Reservation and the Grand Ronde Reservation. Today, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians are living descendants of the Takelma, Shasta, and Letgawa peoples of this area. I encourage you to learn about the land you reside on and to join us in advocating for the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Reverend Ernestine is going to give us a blessing.
Thank you, Sally. This morning, we pray to the God of all peoples for our gathering this day, and we invite God's blessings upon us all, that we will be guided by the Spirit to speak truth, to be open to all ideas, and to welcome all peoples. We give God thanks for this day, and we ask God continued guidance as we go through this day, that He will open our heart to one another, that we may be a blessing to one another, and that we may love and honor one another. Amen.
Thank you. Okay, and we are privileged to have another elder join us today, Robert Kenta. He is an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Shasta and Applegate River Athabascan ancestry. He's worked as the Cultural Resources Director for his tribe for nearly 30 years, and the past 16 plus of those has also served on the elected Siletz Tribal Council. Unofficially, he gets referred to as the Siletz Tribal Historian. And speaking of history, if we are to learn from our history, we must first learn our history. Mistakes have been made in the past, and mistakes are made every day. I myself made a mistake this week, and that's what prompted Robert to contact me. So I said, can we talk? And he gave me a call, and we had a really good conversation. And now I'm really honored to have him here to share some history firsthand with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciated your quick response to my note of concern. And I hope to be able to provide some information here, but just wanted to thank you for the work that you do in diversity and inclusiveness, and the whole committee that's devoted to that work and providing this opportunity for us to share a little bit of our history. So I was born here on what was the Siletz Indian Reservation in 1963, and federal Indian policy in the 1950s misguided the Congress into passing the Western Oregon Indian Termination Act, which dissolved all the federal relationships between federally recognized tribes in Western Oregon and the United States government. So the last bit of our reservation land was taken, and our tribe was pretty much set adrift. So as I was growing up, there was more plain signs of that termination hadn't been a good thing for our community, for our people, and organizing around how to undo some of that damage. And in the early 1970s, we formed as a nonprofit organization, started receiving some small grant monies and lobbying Congress for the repeal of our Termination Act. And we became the second tribe in the United States. And on November 18th, just days from now, when President Jimmy Carter signed the Siletz Restoration Bill into law. November 18th, 1977. And so President Jimmy Carter is still with us and doing great things, and we appreciate him so much. But that was a momentous occasion for us. And I always say that restoration was an event, but it's also an ongoing process. So one that we're actively engaged in and trying to still undo a lot of that negative effects of federal Indian policy and history that our people have labored under. So behind me, you can see a miniature of a baby basket, and up on the wall behind, more baskets. And I've worked in our cultural programs, as was said, for like 30 years. I started learning basketry when I was a teenager and promoting the learning of all those things. Elders shared lots of stories with me, and I'm going to talk about some of that now today, and hopefully we'll have some question and answer time at the end. I tend to ramble though, and overshare, so hopefully I can keep it within the confines of our time. So my great-grandfather was born on the Applegate River in his Dakabetade village. His father was from there. His mother was the sister of Taijan, a Shasta chief. And the war times broke out. He was born about 1847, so he was a small child when the first warfare, really open warfare, happened in the Rogue Valley. Eventually, the 1853 treaty was signed, and his family was on the Table Rock temporary reservation near the town of Rogue River, mouth of Evans Creek, until the last stages of the war broke out. His father was killed by miners, shot on Wolf Creek while he was still a small boy before the end of the wars. His mother was also killed during the fighting. So he came to the reservation as a young orphan boy. And part of his story of growing up and coming to the reservation was recorded by an assistant to Edward Sheriff Curtis, who, if you're familiar with historic Native photography, he was a turn of the century up into the 1920s, famous photographer of Indian people. And he also wrote a 30-volume set on the history of the North American Indian. And in, I can't remember if it's volume 10 of his, in one of the volumes, he actually printed part of the recorded history of my great-grandfather. He starts out pretty rough times, awful times when I'm a baby, Rogue River Indian War at that time. And he starts talking about how his village was attacked and people scattered up into the hills. Basically, him and his grandmother who couldn't run fast. He was just a little boy, orphan boy with his grandmother. And our family story is that they spent that winter in a kind of burned out sugar pine snag. And part of our family history is that they survived on what food he could gather up because she couldn't walk very far. And part of that was the sugar pine pitch that was dripping down inside of that burned out hollow. But you can't survive on that without becoming ill, but it did provide that nutrition, those sugars. And I hope Pastor Ryan is on now because we have lots of connections to the Methodist Church. There was a pastor of the Jacksonville Methodist Church named T.F. Royal, who was in Jacksonville at the time of the Rogue River Wars. He later came to the Siletz Reservation in the 1870s as our minister and school teacher for the reservation. Got to know my great-grandfather basically 20 years after all those horrific things had happened, and heard his story of survival. And he wrote those things down, intended to have them published in the early 1900s when he was an elder. But the Oregon Historical Society has his manuscript materials, his journals from the Rogue River war times and all of those things. And in that version of it, he gives other details of my great-grandfather's story, including his grandmother directing him to go to they're called granary trees, where the acorn woodpeckers this time of the year pick up acorns, peck holes in a tree, and they stuff those acorns into those holes. So the whole tree is just ringed with these holes that are filled with acorns, and that's their food. So his grandmother told him to go to the granary trees and steal some of the acorn woodpeckers' stores, and she processed them up as part of their food to get through that winter. So he comes to the reservation and grows up a young man, going through very hard times among all of our tribes that were forced here onto the reservation at Siletz. And he himself eventually converts to the Methodist Church. And he is the interpreter for the Methodist minister most of his adult years. And when there wasn't a non-Indian minister assigned to our reservation, he stepped in and acted as the lay minister. But when the regular minister was here, he would interpret what the non-Indian minister said into our tribal languages so that all the people could understand what the message was for that sermon. So his daughter, my grandmother, this is a photo of her. And her name was May Adams, and she married a German-Irish man named Downey. And so that was my mother's parents. My own father, his parents were born in Finland, and they came to the Siletz country right after 1900. So guess who I look like? My Finnish relatives. Hopefully this shows up. Also, on this side is my grandmother, May, and her good friend, Arilla Selsick. And these are both photos taken of them posing in regalia, but that wasn't their everyday wear, even in the early 1900s when those photos were taken. Our people adapted to non-Indian modes of dress pretty quickly. Even in the 1850s, that was kind of a status symbol that you didn't have to wear buckskin and shredded maple bark skirts and those kinds of traditional clothes, that people traded for non-Indian clothing pretty quickly and adapted to that form of dress. So once our people had signed treaties, given up our lands in the Rogue River Valley, and come to the reservation, the government pretty quickly forgot its responsibilities under the treaties and started dismantling the reservation that was promised to us as our permanent home right out from under us. In 1865 and 75, those combined actions took away 3/4 of our reservation without any treaty agreement or compensation for the losses, and opened those areas to non-Indian settlement. And then in 1891, 92, an 1887 act of Congress called the General Allotment Act took effect on our reservation too. And it was meant to break up communal ownership of reservation lands. So little lots were surveyed out of the reservation and assigned to the individual tribal members, and then held in trust by the government until that tribal member was considered a competent Indian, one that could speak English well enough and conduct their personal affairs like the average US citizen, and then they get clear title to that property. It would no longer be reservation land, and that person would be treated as more or less as a US citizen. So that act in itself and its implementation in Indian country was devastating. It was another way for our tribal people to lose land. And there were 551 allotments of 80 acres each that were assigned on our reservation. And then the rest of the reservation, basically, there was over 191,000 acres that remained of the reservation at that time. And it was opened up to non-Indian settlement. And so my family was devastated by that on one side, and then my Finnish relatives and the German-Irish side were able to benefit from that by coming in to what had been Indian reservation and settling. So I'm all conflicted within myself at times as to, my varieties of ancestry and histories and connections to those histories. The grandmother that I showed the picture of here too, her mother was half Shasta Indian because her grandmother had a relationship with one of the soldiers here at the blockhouse on the reservation. So that's another way that our family is connected multiple ways to the reservation history. And even though it was supposed to be illegal for soldiers and officers to have relationships with Indian women on the reservation, it was a very common practice. And so like a big portion of the Siletz tribe is descended from Klamath Annie, who had relationship with this John Hunsucker soldier. They had 2 daughters together, and from those 2 daughters, a big portion of our tribal genealogy is descended from. So, you know, there's love stories, there's war stories, there's all of those things, and just a lot of hardship that a lot of people went through. And I don't know if is Reverend Pastor Ryan on yet?
I am not seeing him yet.
Okay.
Again,
good.
for other people here, he is at a city council, or not a city council, but a roundtable with the city about a warming shelter. So hopefully he'll be able to join us soon, but I'm glad he's doing that work too.
Yeah, that's important work to carry on, and appreciate him doing that. And I know he has some information that he was intending to share, wanting to share today, and I just wanted to check in. Hopefully he makes us aware when he does check in. I did want to leave lots of time for question and answer. If there's particular parts of history. If there aren't that many questions, I can ramble on farther too, but just wanted to give some of those basic details of history. And, you know, the land acknowledgement, I helped with the drafting of that land acknowledgement, and we were being very conciliatory to our neighbors at Grand Round. But even the federal courts decided in the 1940s and 50s that the Rogue River tribe, all of those confederated tribes and bands under the 1853 and 54 treaties that became the Rogue River tribe, the majority of those people came to the Siletz reservation, and that we were determined to have standing to represent those claims in the federal court. And that Grand Round did not, even though they do have some ancestry from the Rogue Valley. And we worked together on things like, some of you may have heard about the Indigenous Gardens Network project that Brooke Colley at Southern Oregon University was able to secure some funding to do some collaborative work with land management agencies and land conservation entities in the Rogue Valley for access and enhancement, reconnection to traditional foods in the area. So we do collaborate on some things, but we also want to make it clear that the majority of that history is connected to the Siletz reservation. Are you seeing any questions, hands raised, or anything yet?
Give a moment here. If you would like to unmute yourself, please do. If you have a question, and we'll just be quiet for a moment and give you a chance. And then Robert, if not, please do ramble on.
We have a
You're not
question.
rambling.
We have a question in the chat. Are there any good books on the local history that our library should have?
Yes, we worked with Charles Wilkinson about 10 years ago or so now. He did a 5-year project. He's a professor of federal Indian law at University of Colorado Boulder. And in the early 1970s, he came here to Siletz as our initial attorney for the restoration movement. He was a law professor at University of Colorado Boulder, but also working with the Native American Rights Fund organization that's also based in Boulder, Colorado. And NARF and University of Colorado sent him. He went on sabbatical from Colorado, came to the University of Oregon and taught federal Indian law there while he was acting as our attorney for the restoration movement. So years later, about 10 years ago, we published a book. He published a book, and we had a tribal committee working with him on the development of that material. He had his own student researchers as interns working through his office, and he had determination as to what to include in the book. But it's a pretty complete work on the history of the Siletz tribe. Includes all the pre-reservation, pre-treaty days, through that treaty history and removal to the reservation, and all of the things that we've dealt with in our history since removal to the reservation, including those reductions, all of that. And so the book is called The People Are Dancing Again, and it's named after a film piece of that same title that was developed as a promotional piece for our efforts to lobby for restoration in the 70s. And so we consider that one of the really good primary sources. We tried to catch all of the little typo glitches by committee work, and there are a couple of tiny minor errors in the book, but it's a very big, extensive book. About the back third of the book is his end notes. So it's pretty extensively footnoted as to what his sources were and additional details that didn't make it into the actual text of the book. I see somebody's noting that they have a copy in one of the libraries. So if you don't have a copy for one of your libraries locally there, let us know and we can make a copy available to you. Also on our tribal website, www.ctsi.nsn.us. So if you just Google CTSI, it should pop up. In there, I think we still have an annotated bibliography of recommended reading. And there may even be a couple of books that we make some critical notes on. One of the area historians for Western Oregon, Stephen Dow Beckham, he did some pretty good writing in the 1970s. Requiem for a People is one of his books. The Indians of Western Oregon, This Land Was Theirs was another one. And then after that point, he started being a contract historian to the detriment of truthfulness, in my opinion. So he became a historian for hire and started saying things that even contradicted some of his earlier writings. So I still consider those two earlier books, though, Requiem for a People and The Indians of Western Oregon, This Land Was Theirs, as some of his better work.
We have another question in the chat. Do you have an opinion on the Flying Lark becoming a gambling casino in regards to tribes are supposed to be able to earn money gambling? That's a local hot topic.
Yes, it's a hot topic in the area, and it has lots of political implications. And the Oregon Racing Commission has some authorities there, and there's complaints about their level of communication and consultation with tribes on the issue, and all of that's being bandied about at present. We have to wait and see whether the Oregon Racing Commission actually issues a license for that business to do that. And then we'll have to make our decisions as to whether to sue. I see people are making notes in the chat as to those titles. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Another question is, are there any treaties the government has not broken?
I don't know of any. Treaties under federal law are supposed to be the law of the land. And in 1871, the US House of Representatives got too upset over having to make appropriations for treaties that they didn't have a say in approving. And so the compromise was that treaty making with tribes ended officially.
Recording in progress.
And sounds like somebody's logging on. And so that treaty making officially ended. And treaty making is by the US government's representatives with that foreign government or tribe. And then the US Senate has treaty making ability, and then it's proclaimed law by the president. So the House of Representatives, Congress didn't have any say. So they said we'll only have agreements with tribes from 1871 forward. And to some extent, well, they confirmed that any treaties that had been negotiated and ratified up to that point are still supposed to be the law of the land. But there's just been a pretty horrific record of non-compliance on the US's side with pretty much all of the treaties that that were signed and ratified up to 1871. And you know, we lost our reservation land through non-compliance with the treaty. We never have had our hunting, fishing, and gathering rights confirmed. And yeah, there's been a lot of just non-compliance, and tribes have to live under those circumstances and the consequences of those acts of non-compliance. There have been some big wins in the federal courts over the years on forcing the US to comply with some aspects of some of the treaties. But it's always a gamble for a tribe to concede to have those issues decided by a US court. You never know what the court makeup is going to be, the judges who are going to be hearing those decisions. Our tribe ourselves have had some poor decisions made in the Supreme Court. There's actually been a book written about, I think it's the 10 worst decisions by federal courts. I think it's one of Walter Echohawk's books, one of the founders of the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder. So there's some really poor examples of federal courts opining on what tribes' rights are, what level of sovereignty we have even. And some of that is in conflict with constitutional language of the US Constitution. Is there another question yet, or should I ramble on?
Some of the people from Southern Oregon were taken by boat up to the Columbia River and into the Willamette Valley, and some were driven up in February, I believe, to the Willamette Valley in 1856, I believe. Do you remember, do you know which your family was a part of?
My great-grandfather, even though his uncle was Taijan, their family was kind of split up, separated from the wars. Like I said, he was with his grandmother living in a hollow snag. So that when he was found by his father's brother, his uncle, and the grandmother couldn't walk anymore. They had to leave her there. His uncle eventually was killed, and then in the story that was printed in Curtis's book, it said that another he calls him a Klamath Indian, but here at Siletz, all of the upper Klamath River Shasta people were referred to as Klamaths. So he said a Klamath Indian found him and brought him to the new reservation. So I assume that meant that they walked, but we don't have that complete story. He was kind of reticent to talk about some of the details of his childhood in some of those aspects. And my grandmother never completely learned her mother's and father's Indian languages they kept it as something that they spoke when they didn't want the kids to fully know what they were talking about. And federal Indian policy was kind of designed to take those things, take the Indian out of the Indian. And that's what boarding school policy was all about, round up all the kids and put them in a atmosphere where they were punished for speaking their Indian language and all of those things. So my grandmother was of that generation. So we have gaps in our family history knowledge ourselves.
So Robert, speaking of language, we have one more question in the chat, and then Reverend Ryan has joined us. So after this question, then we'll let him present a little bit. So the question is, what languages were spoken by the Siletz tribes, and are there resources to learn more about them?
Yeah, we have basically 10 or 11 different languages represented within our confederation. We're probably the broadest confederation of tribes on a single reservation. Now, one of those languages, we don't actually claim that territory as our ancestral territory. There was just a few individuals or families from the Klickitat tribe in South Central Washington. The majority of those people are on the Yakima reservation, but some of those people came into Western Oregon pretty early and intermarried. And so that's one of our languages, Sahaptin Klickitat language. And then the Chinookan languages from basically that area of the Columbia River down to the mouth, including Clatsop, Cathlamet, Multnomah, Clackamas, Wasco. We have elements of all of those people in our confederation. Then Tillamook language is the southernmost Salish language in the world. So from just south of Seaside on the Oregon coast, down to Cape Foulweather below the mouth of the Siletz River, that's all Tillamook language. Then inland, you have the Kalapuyan peoples, mainly of the Willamette Valley, Molala language, Alsea, Yaquina, and there used to be a Yahats tribe that was killed off by all the epidemics right about early reservation days. Then south of them is Sayusla Lower Umpqua is considered a different dialect, basically of that same Alsea Yaquina language. And then south of them is two dialects of Coos language. Below them is a whole string of Athabascan coastal peoples. My great-grandfather's people were the inland, most inland of those people, the Applegate River Athabascan, a little island of Athabascans, and then Galeese Creek was a very similar dialect. And Shasta language to the east and south of them, Takelma language, that's most of them. Upper Umpqua is another inland Athabascan dialect. Who would I forget? Anybody? It's complicated. And so there's the Northwest trade language too, Chinook jargon or Chinook Wawa, and that had a lot of use here on the reservation in the early days. Our Southern Oregon people, when the first treaty negotiations were going on, those translations had to happen in that trade language, but even the US representatives recognized, they said that there was an imperfect use or knowledge of trade language in the Rogue Valley at that time. But by the end of the Rogue River Wars, we were getting pretty good at sassing the soldiers and the volunteers in Chinook jargon, have them pinned down where they didn't have a water source and say, "Maiga tiki Chuck, hello Chuck Boston, you want some water? No water for you." Taunting people that way. But so it really had a lot of use here on the reservation because so many people speaking so many different languages that trade language, even though it's kind of rudimentary, it doesn't have a huge vocabulary. You can get kind of creative with that limited vocabulary, but it really gave the tribal people a way to have a common language before English came into common use. So
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead now, Ryan, if you are, I think you are here online.
Yep, I'm here.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that Robert was able to join us today. I'm excited that we've been able to have him. And I don't know what's been covered already. I was in a meeting talking about warming centers, and it looks like Grants Pass will be getting a warming center this winter. So that's something we can all celebrate a little bit. So that, since I don't like speaking from areas where I don't have a lot of knowledge, so I thought I would share kind of specifically from the religious perspective, not perspective, some of the religious history and the church's relations with the history of the Rogue River tribes and all that. It's not a pretty history. It doesn't paint the Methodists or the early settlers well at all, but I wanted to share some of that with y'all since we do have that history. And it's important for us to recognize this history so that we don't, repeat similar mistakes, or that we recognize, that despite our speaking for Newman, we think of ourselves as this progressive church that does all these great things for the community and has been here for, over 100 years, helping people and doing good things. But we can't say that and also not recognize our history and our participation in the atrocities of the past. And that starts with one of Oregon's original pioneers, Jed Smith. And if I go over anything that Robert's already talked about, just interrupt me and let me know. But Jedediah Smith was one of Oregon's early pioneers. He created the Southern Passage, which kind of became the Applegate Trail, and really kind of opened up the West to white settlers. And he was a Methodist preacher himself, and did not have great relationships with the tribes as they came through, and it's kind of a sad history with that. But even worse was the architect behind a lot of these, the forced removal of indigenous people from Southern Oregon was Joel Palmer, who was a United Methodist he was a United Methodist, and he was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Oregon Territory. And Palmer was a Methodist. A few decades after the establishment of the reservations, Palmer and a certain Methodist bishop named John Newman devised a plan that would essentially give all control of the reservations to the Methodist Board of Missions. And I know, Robert, there's a history of that with the Siletz tribe. They were part of this, having the control given over to the Methodist Board of Missions, which was not a good thing. I know Robert talked a little bit about the boarding schools and everything that happened with that. But yeah, Bishop Newman was close friends with a lot of people in places of power in Washington, D.C., including President Pierce and President Grant later on, that really instigated these policies from Washington and made them happen in Oregon. And this is the same Newman that Newman United Methodist Church is named for. He's revered in history as a international traveler and delegate of peace around the world, but people often forget about this history he had in influencing people in Washington and conspiring against indigenous populations in the West, so that the Methodist Board of Missions could gain control over these reservations and control over the people. And this policy led to the abusive practices that many U.S. churches participated in, primarily Protestant denominations. So again, it's just important to recognize this history. It's important to have that history and honor it and recognize it and learn from it in the past, so that we can begin to make those reparations and begin to make those a process of reconciliation with our indigenous folks around the state, around the West. There's a lot of hurt that needs to be acknowledged and addressed that hasn't been addressed for far too long. So that's kind of the main bit of what I wanted to share, and I'm happy to answer any questions or have any kind of conversation about that.
thank you, Ryan. I learned some things there. I didn't know much about Newman. And hopefully, I know you're a busy guy, but hopefully you get a chance to watch the rest of the recording. And you can hear my family's relationship to the Methodist Church and T.F. Royal. I don't know if you've heard his name before. He was a minister in Jacksonville in the 1850s, and he kept extensive journals, personal journals. And he also came to the Siletz Reservation in the early 1870s or mid 1870s, got to know my great-grandfather, who himself was an interpreter for the Methodist minister. And he actually he wrote manuscript materials, notes that he intended to publish as like a history writing. But he was very fascinated by my great-grandfather's story of survival of the Rogue River Wars. And so not only did Edward Curtis, the famous Indian photographer from the early 1900s, write a version of the story of my great-grandfather, but up at the Oregon Historical Society, they have T.F. Royal's collection of journals and manuscript writings that he intended to publish. And that gives another version of my great-grandfather's story. So hopefully we're able to, you're able to view that, and we can communicate after you viewed it and collaborate a little bit more on putting some of that history together, because it's important, you know, like life-changing stuff for all of our generations here. And I appreciate the Methodist Church and others for doing that work of reconciliation that's been going on.
Yeah, it's hard work. I know the Oregon, Idaho Annual Conference of United Methodists has been working with doing a lot of reconciliation and giving back land in the Idaho portion of our annual conference. We've given back chunks of land that the church has held on to back to the Nez Perce tribes. And I think that's potentially a direction to go in the western part of the state as well.
Are you familiar with Reverend Gustavus Hines and his history?
No, I'm not.
He came out here with the Reverend Jason Lee mission, 1830s, and pretty quickly, though, he seems to have gone away from wanting to be a missionary to being a promoter of settlement. And he went on a journey with, I think, Jason and his nephew, is it Daniel Lee? That they had the mission in the Willamette Valley, and then they went down to the Umpqua Valley and down pretty much the Umpqua River just about to the coast. And I don't know if it was at the end of that trip, but at some point, Reverend Gustavus Hines writes the comment that's been often quoted: "The hand of Providence is rapidly removing this wretched race from basically the landscape, making a way for a population much more suited to like benefit from its bounty," or something along those lines. You know, for a minister to the native people, he became jaded pretty quickly.
Let's see, we have an earlier question. What is the relationship of Siletz to Cow Creek Umpqua?
Yeah, so the original Cow Creek band of Umpqua people were the northernmost Takelman speaking people. And they signed a treaty right after our Table Rock Treaty was signed. The Table Rock Treaty was signed September 10th, 1853, and September 19th, the Cow Creek Treaty was signed. Those treaties traveled together back to Washington, D.C., and were ratified in the same time frame and proclaimed law by the president, I believe in 1854. And so that when the reservation was created here at Siletz in 1855, those people were removed here, initially to the encampment at Grand Round. And then in May of 1857, all of the upper Rogue Valley, or the majority of the upper Rogue Valley peoples and all of the Cow Creek people were marched from that Grand Round encampment down through the western part of the Willamette Valley over the hill from Fort Hoskins here to the Upper Siletz River. It was called Upper Farm, and that was their permanent place of settlement. So that when the Siletz agent wrote his annual report, he comments on that movement of people here to Siletz Agency. And he said in his notes, he said, I recommend the confederating of the Cow Creek with the Rogue River tribe because they are all united and speak the same tongue. And Joel Palmer was mentioned earlier. I think he was raised Quaker, but then became Methodist affiliated because there wasn't really a Shaker, I mean, not Shaker, but Quaker church for him to continue affiliation with here in Oregon. Now, his interpreter was a man named John Flett, who I think had been here with the Hudson Bay Company pretty early, French Canadian. Some of his personal papers are up in Washington State Historical Society. And in there, he talks about the movement of the Cow Creek, the original Cow Creek tribe to the Siletz Reservation. And he said it was mostly older people. And he said there were some of the most ancient specimens of humanity among them. He said some of the older women practically mummies. And he described Chief Miwaleta in later, after the treaty signing, he started going by the name Old Jackson. And so he refers to that Chief Old Jackson's sister, reminding the people as they were being rounded up to be marched from that encampment at Grand Round to Siletz. She said, now all you people will remember that I warned, I had a premonition basically that if our people moved out of our home area, that we would suffer and there would be lots of death. And that first year at that Grand Round encampment, or first few months, all of the Rogue River tribes, Cow Creek tribes, lots of the people had epidemics sweeping through them. And so she said, we've lost a lot of our people. And she goes, I don't know what's going to happen if we make this move again to Siletz. And so there was a big conflict that sprung out of that. They didn't want to be reminded of that, and they basically killed her, probably at Grand Round encampment before being moved here to Siletz. He doesn't really say, maybe it happened after they arrived here, but he said that they were suspicious and resentful of her for reminding them of, it was kind of like I told you so kind of a moment. That's some of the history. And then the Cow Creek people themselves were kind of a small group. Even at removal times, I think there's numbers of like 19 or 20 people. Because of disease and warfare, they'd been reduced down to a very few number anyway. And so that remnant of people just kind of melded into the rest of the Rogue River tribe here at Upper Farm. But we know, like, the Galeese Creek chief just told that salmon fisher, or no. Anyway, the Galeese Creek chief that went by the name Tennis Tyee here on the reservation, his wife was Cow Creek because his daughter Lily Puncy, her lineage carries that Cow Creek blood here at Siletz, and so does our first elected chief of all the Confederated tribes here at Siletz, George Harney. He was a nephew of Tyee George from the Rogue River Wars. George Harney and Frances Johnson's mother, she was from Cow Creek people. So we carry that identity here. Lots of the families in the contemporary Cow Creek tribe are actually descended from a Chinook woman. And Sue Schaefer's family are actually descended from a Walla Walla Indian who ended up living in the Umpqua Valley. So lots of the families there really don't have connection to the original Cow Creek people.
There was a question much earlier. I don't have it exactly, but it had to do with how do we pronounce words, names, if we're not sure? How do we find out how to do a correct pronunciation?
Boy, that's a good question. I mispronounce things all the time. And there's multiple pronunciations too, like Heseda head versus Hecata head. All the old timers used to say Hecata. And then kind of there was a more modern reintroduction to the history of how that name, it was Juan Bruno de Heseda or something, was a Spanish explorer that Heseda had started being referred to, or it was named after him. But a lot of the old timers, when I was growing up, everybody said Hecata, but everybody's kind of switched over to the Heseda. Trying to think of a similar one, like Blanco and Blanco too on the southern coast. Everybody used to say Blanco, but Blanco is actually the Spanish language term.
I'm noticing we are getting close to 1 o'clock. I'm going to put a evaluation form in the chat. We would like to get your feedback. It just takes a couple of minutes. I'll go ahead and post that too. And if there's any final questions that anybody, oh, please, David.
Robert, are you aware of the issue of the totem poles in Rogue River that were done by a non-native artist that are being taken down at the request of the library there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I've been in email contact with some of the folks around that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there was the mascots issue that came up a few years ago, and it was being pressed by the Oregon Indian Education Association's executive board, but we didn't exactly agree with all of their assumptions about how Native mascots affected us. And there was, to us, it was kind of like a movement to remove Indian references, and lots of place names controversies too have kind of gone on that track of, well, let's remove that offensive name and then replace it with something that has absolutely no Native association. So through that, we were able to do agreements where schools were able to maintain their Native mascot as long as there was agreement with the tribe on appropriate, that there weren't stereotypical or offensive behaviors or imagery around that. And so we have an agreement with Rogue River schools. And most of that relationship was with our former general manager. And that was part of this recent email about the totem poles, is we need to kind of redevelop that relationship since that general manager is no longer with us.
Thank you.
All right, and it is now 1 o'clock, so a really big thank you, Robert. We appreciate you joining us, and again, thanks for reaching out. And we'll be having him back. He shared some other history with me and some more information that we'd like to share. And then reminding you, December, we're not going to be meeting for our usual time, but January, it'll be Monday evening, January 17th in the evening, and our website will have more details. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Be safe.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for all your help in your department, Robert, with the names for the bear and the osprey too for our statue here.
Amen.
I went out and said hi to them right before this.
Yes, I did too.
Yeah. Very good.